My husband looked me in the eye and said I was outdated, while his mistress, my best friend, smirked behind a glass of my expensive Chardonnay. They had already stolen $400,000 from me, thinking I was too blinded by tradition to notice. But the outdated woman they despised was about to become their worst nightmare in federal court. Let me tell you how it all began. The rain in Northern California doesn't just fall. It possesses a rhythmic, relentless gray that usually brings me peace. As a heritage preservationist, I've spent my life appreciating things that weather the storm. But that Tuesday afternoon, as I stepped into our Tudor-style home in Pasadena 3 hours earlier than expected, the rain felt like a warning I was too late to heed. The house was too quiet, yet the air was thick with the scent of expensive sandalwood and my favorite vintage Chardonnay, a bottle I had been saving for our 10th anniversary. Then came the laughter. It wasn't the warm, shared laughter of a marriage. It was sharp, predatory. I didn't rush. I've learned through decades of restoring fragile artifacts that the most important details are found in the stillness. I stood in the foyer, my damp trench coat heavy on my shoulders, and listened as the two people I loved most in this world dismantled my life. "She'll never even notice the transfers," Julian's voice drifted from the study, smooth as silk and just as slippery. "Eleanor lives in the 19th century. As long as she has her dusty vases and her legacy projects, she's blind to the digital age. I've already moved another $50,000 into the Aura Holdings account this morning." And the mother? That was Sylvia, my best friend of 22 years, the woman who held my hand at my father's funeral. Her voice was light, airy, and utterly devoid of the empathy she had sold me for 2 decades. "The estate taxes on that antique collection are going to be a nightmare if we don't move her soon." "Don't worry," Julian replied, the clink of ice against crystal punctuating his words. "I've already scouted a facility in Arizona, remote, affordable. Once Eleanor is served the papers, we'll move the old woman there. It's for her safety, of course. We'll have the house and the collection cleared out before Eleanor even finds a lawyer." I felt a coldness settle into my marrow that had nothing to do with the rain. I walked toward the study, my footsteps silenced by the thick Persian rugs I had bought with my own inheritance. I pushed the door open. The scene was a caricature of betrayal. Julian was leaned back in my father's leather armchair, his silk tie loosened. Sylvia was perched on the edge of the desk, swirling a glass of that golden Chardonnay. She didn't even have the decency to look startled. She just smirked, a slow, ugly thing that revealed the stranger hiding behind the mask of my friend. Julian didn't jump. He didn't apologize. He looked at me with a bored, clinical detachment that was more violent than a physical blow. He set his glass down and stood up, smoothing his Italian suit. "You're home early, Eleanor. Pity. I wanted to have the movers scheduled before we had this conversation." He reached into his briefcase and tossed a thick manila envelope onto the mahogany desk. "There are the divorce papers. Don't bother with the dramatics. It's over." I looked at the envelope, then at him. "The Aura Holdings account, Julian? You've been stealing from the joint fund for 5 years." He chuckled, a dry, grating sound. "Stealing is such a provincial word. I've been optimizing assets that you were clearly too stagnant to manage. Let's be honest, Eleanor. You're outdated. You're like one of those cracked teapots you spend all day gluing back together. Noble in theory, but completely useless in a modern world." Sylvia took a slow sip of the wine, her eyes scanning me from my sensible heels to my damp hair. "He's right, Elle. You've become a ghost in your own life. You cling to tradition and integrity like they're life rafts, but you're drowning. We're just throwing you a line so we can actually enjoy the world you're too afraid to live in." I looked at the Chardonnay in her hand. My Chardonnay. "I built this home," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "I supported your firm when it was nothing but a rented desk and a phone line, Julian." I gave you the capital to breathe. And I'm grateful for the seed money, Julian said, his voice dropping into that cold, professional register he used for firing subordinates. But the investment has matured, and I'm liquidating. You can keep your sentimental value, Eleanor. I'll take the market value. You have 48 hours to pack your things. I'm keeping the house. It's already been appraised and factored into the settlement. He walked toward me, smelling of success and betrayal. He stopped just inches from my face, his eyes devoid of any flicker of the man I thought I knew. Go find a nice, quiet apartment, Eleanor. Maybe a hobby, something age-appropriate. He brushed past me, his shoulder hitting mine with a dismissive force. Sylvia followed, pausing just long enough to set her empty wine glass on a delicate 18th century side table, leaving a wet, permanent ring on the wood. "Ta-ta, Elle," she whispered, her eyes dancing with a cruel, vibrant energy. "Don't take it personally. It's just business." The front door heavy-thudded shut, the sound echoing through the cavernous hallways. The silence that followed was deafening. I stood in the middle of the room, surrounded by the history they despised and the wealth they had bled dry. They thought they had left a broken woman behind. They thought my tradition was a weakness. They didn't realize that in my world, outdated doesn't mean broken. It means enduring. It means knowing exactly how to spot a forgery. And as I looked at the ring on the table and the papers on the desk, a new kind of fire began to burn through the ice. Julian and Sylvia had spent years planning my ruin, but they had made one fatal mistake. They forgot that I'm an expert at uncovering what people try to bury. I stood there in the silence of a home that no longer felt mine. If you've ever felt the cold sting of betrayal from the people you trusted most, please hit like and let me know in the comments where you are listening from. Your support means everything to me right now. The heavy click of the front door echoed through the hallway, a final metallic punctuation to the life I thought I knew. I stared at the wet ring Sylvia's wine glass had left on the 18th century mahogany table. To her, it was just a smudge on a piece of old wood. To me, it was a wound on a piece of history I had spent 3 months painstakingly restoring with a horsehair brush and organic solvents. I sank into the chair Julian had just vacated, the leather still warm from his betrayal. My mind, trained to trace the provenance of ancient artifacts, instinctively began to pull at the threads of the last 6 years. They say you can't see a masterpiece if you're standing too close to the canvas, and God, was I close. I had been so busy painting the background of Julian's success that I never realized I was being erased from the frame. 6 years ago, Julian wasn't the man in the Italian suit with a polished sneer. He was a hungry, charismatic analyst with a vision and a desk made of 2 sawn-off doors. I remember the night we sat on the floor of our tiny, drafty apartment in Silver Lake, sharing a single box of Thai takeout because every spare cent was being funneled into his dream, Vance Capital. "One day, Elle," he had whispered, his eyes bright with a fire I mistook for passion for our future. "We'll have the estate. We'll have the name. You won't have to spend your weekends in dusty museum basements anymore." I had smiled then, leaning my head on his shoulder, smelling the ink on his fingers and the cheap coffee on his breath. I didn't mind the dusty basements. I loved the work. I loved the idea of taking something broken, a forgotten letter, a tarnished silver goblet, and giving it back its dignity. I thought we were doing the same for our lives. My parents had raised me with a singular, unshakable belief in the American dream, that if you put your head down, worked harder than everyone else, and maintained your integrity, the world would eventually bow to your efforts. I was the embodiment of that pull yourself up by your bootstraps mentality. When my father passed away, leaving me a modest but significant inheritance and a collection of rare Americana, I didn't buy a Ferrari or a beach house in Malibu. I looked at Julian, who was struggling to secure his first round of funding, and I handed him the keys to my legacy. "It's $250,000, Julian," I told him that night, my heart racing. "It's everything my father worked for. Use it to build the firm. Use it to build us." He had cried that night, Or at least, I thought he had. Now, with the clarity of a woman who has just seen the devil in a silk tie, I wonder if those were tears of joy for the easy mark he had found. For the first 3 years, I was the silent engine of Vance Capital. I wasn't just the wife. I was the ghostwriter of his success. While Julian was out at steak dinners and golf courses, charming investors with a charisma I helped him cultivate, I was at home, editing his prospectuses, fact-checking his data, and ensuring his social calendar was filled with the right people. I curated his image like I curated a museum exhibit. I taught him which fork to use, which wines signaled old money versus newly rich, and how to speak to the elite of Pasadena with a cadence that suggested he had been born among them. I lived frugally, wearing the same 3 professional suits for years so he could afford the lease on a luxury SUV that signaled stability to his clients. I skipped vacations, telling myself that the satisfaction of a job well done was better than a week in Maui. I was building a fortress, stone by stone, sacrifice by sacrifice. I thought Julian was the commander of that fortress. I didn't realize he was just a squatter, waiting for the right moment to kick the architect out. And then there was Sylvia, my sister in every way but blood. We met at UCLA, 2 girls from modest backgrounds trying to make sense of the art world. When she struggled to get her interior design business off the ground, I was the one who recommended her to every wealthy donor at the museum. I gave her the A-list contacts that became her golden ticket. I let her into my home, my marriage, and my heart, thinking her frequent visits were a sign of a bond that time couldn't break. I remember a particular evening, 2 years ago. Julian had just landed a massive account, and Sylvia had come over to celebrate. She brought a bottle of wine, not the expensive stuff she drinks now, but something mid-range. "You're so lucky, Elle," she had said, her eyes scanning the antique clock on the mantel. "You have the history, the husband, and the stability. Most women would kill for what you have." I had laughed, genuinely touched. "It's not luck, Sylvia. It's just work. We've all worked for this." She had smiled then, a small, tight expression I now recognize as pure, unadulterated envy. She didn't want to work for it. She wanted the shortcut. And she found it in the man I was busy optimizing. As I sat there in the quiet of the rain-soaked afternoon, I realized my mistake. I had treated my marriage like a historic preservation project, believing that if I just kept polishing it, just kept protecting it from the elements, it would last forever. But you can't preserve something that was a forgery from the start. Julian called me outdated. He thought my belief in loyalty and hard work was a relic of a bygone era, as useless as a cracked teapot. But Julian forgot one thing about relics. When you strip away the grime and the lies, the ones made of true gold are heavier and harder than anything modern. My father's legacy wasn't the money Julian had moved into Aura Holdings. It wasn't the house he thought he was keeping. My legacy was the grit he had mistaken for stagnation. I stood up, the dampness of my coat no longer bothering me. The silence was no longer heavy. It was clear. I walked over to the side table, took a silk coaster, and wiped the wet ring Sylvia had left on the wood. I didn't do it because I was a good wife anymore. I did it because this was my house, and I was done letting trash ruin my things. The outdated woman was about to start her own restoration project. And this time, I wasn't going to be using soft brushes. I was going to use the law. As I polished the mahogany, my fingers traced the grain with a muscle memory that felt like a mockery of the years I'd spent protecting this house. I realized then that the most dangerous forgeries aren't the ones you find in a museum. They are the ones you let sleep in your guest room. Sylvia hadn't just been my friend. She had been the architect of my isolation, designing a world where I was the only one who didn't know the walls were closing in. She had perfected the art of the velvet mask, a soft, empathetic exterior that hid a mind as cold as a calculator. I remembered a rainy Tuesday 3 years ago, much like this one. We were sitting in this very room, and I was expressing my concerns about the fluctuating market and our family's long-term security. Sylvia had reached across the table, her hand warm and steady on mine, her eyes swimming with a practiced, sisterly concern. "Elle," she had whispered, "you're so diligent, but you're exhausted. You carry the weight of this legacy like a burden. Julian and I were talking. There's a lifestyle-focused fund called Aura Holdings. It's private, secure, and it focuses on the things we love: heritage, design, luxury real estate. It's the modern way to protect what you've built." I had trusted her because she was the person who knew which colors made me feel safe and which stories about my father made me cry. I didn't see the red flags then because I was looking through the lens of a 20-year bond. I didn't notice how she started to subtly question my memory during our lunches, or how she'd tilt her head and say, "Are you sure you said that, Elle? You've been so stressed lately, maybe you're just misremembering." It was a slow, methodical erosion of my confidence. Sylvia wasn't just stealing my husband, she was stealing my reality. She would suggest therapeutic retreats that were actually ways to get me out of the house, so she and Julian could have more time to collaborate on their financial maneuvers. She'd bring me herbal teas for my nerves, and then mention to Julian, loud enough for me to overhear, how worried she was that I was becoming unstable or too attached to the past. At the time, I thought she was my advocate. Now, I see she was the witness they were grooming to testify against my sanity. She used her career as an interior designer to justify her presence in every corner of my life, advising me on modernizing my portfolio, while she was actually helping Julian liquidate it. Every time she complimented my classic taste, she was secretly labeling me as a dinosaur in her head, someone too stuck in the outdated ways of honesty to see a digital heist in progress. The irony was sharp enough to draw blood. I had given Sylvia the keys to the kingdom because I believed in the sanctity of a shared history. In our culture, especially in circles like ours in Pasadena, your social capital is built on these long-standing loyalties. You don't suspect your bridesmaid of being a parasite. But as I looked around the room, seeing it through her eyes, the eyes of a scavenger, I realized she had never seen the beauty of the antiques. She only saw the price tags. She had spent 5 years curating my ruin, sitting across from me at Thanksgiving dinners, toasted to my health while she was mentally measuring the square footage of my bedroom for her own furniture. She had played the role of the supportive best friend so convincingly that I had almost started to believe I was as fragile as she whispered I was. But Sylvia made one critical error in her design. She underestimated the materials she was working with. She thought she was manipulating silk, something that tears under pressure. She didn't realize I was more like the tempered glass I used in my conservation work. Clear, seemingly invisible, but incredibly hard to break and capable of cutting deep if shattered. Her velvet mask had finally slipped today in the study, revealing the sneer of a woman who thought she had already won the lottery. She didn't just want my money or my husband. She wanted the satisfaction of watching the perfect Eleanor Vance fall apart. She wanted to prove that my integrity was a weakness. The realization hit me with the force of a tidal wave. All those safe investments she pushed me toward, the Aura Holdings transfers, the strategic loss harvesting accounts, they weren't just bad advice. They were a trail of breadcrumbs leading straight to her and Julian's shared offshore dreams. Every time she had told me to take a breath and let the professionals handle it, she was really saying, "Stand still while we pick your pockets." I had been so worried about being a good friend, a good wife, a good daughter, that I had stopped being a good guardian of my own life. I stood up from the table, my movements fluid and cold. The nerves Sylvia had spent years trying to cultivate in me were gone, replaced by a crystalline focus. She and Julian thought they were the only ones who knew how to play a role. They thought I was a ghost in my own home, a relic waiting to be crated up and shipped to a dark corner of the world. But a ghost doesn't have a voice, and a relic doesn't fight back. I walked to the kitchen and poured the rest of that tainted Chardonnay down the drain, watching the gold liquid disappear into the dark. I wasn't the one who was unstable. I wasn't the one who was outdated. I was the one who was still standing. And as for the velvet mask Sylvia wore so well, I was going to enjoy peeling it off, layer by agonizing layer, in front of everyone who ever believed her lies. The silence of the house was no longer a weight. It was a weapon. I was done being the curator of their happiness. It was time to start the excavation of their crimes. I didn't go to the bedroom to cry. I didn't reach for a suitcase to pack. Instead, I walked down the long, shadowed hallway to the one room Julian always called the archive of useless things, my private study. It was a sanctuary of soft light, the scent of beeswax, and the quiet hum of professional-grade scanners. As a heritage preservationist, I don't just look at objects. I look through them. I look for the hidden layers, the microscopic inconsistencies that tell the true story of an artifact's journey. Julian thought my skills were limited to dusting off old vases, but he had forgotten that my entire career was built on one single devastating ability. I am an expert at identifying a fraud. I closed the heavy oak door and locked it. The click felt like the first move in a grand game of chess. The rain lashed against the leaded glass windows, but inside I was as cold and precise as a surgical blade. I sat at my workstation and pulled up the digital backups of our joint accounts. Julian believed he had been clever by modernizing our finances and moving everything to paperless statements. He thought that by burying the trail in a labyrinth of digital folders and cloud-based spreadsheets, he had rendered it invisible to my outdated eyes. What he didn't realize was that digital footprints are just like ink on parchment. They have a flow, a pressure, and a source. I began with the Aura Holdings transfers. Using the same forensic software I used to verify the provenance of 18th century land grants, I started cross-referencing the dates of the withdrawals with Sylvia's consultation invoices. A pattern began to emerge, as clear and ugly as a crack in a Ming vase. Every time Sylvia sat in my living room and suggested I invest in my future, a sum of $10,000 or $15,000 would vanish from our primary investment account 48 hours later. Julian had been siphoning the lifeblood of my inheritance, while Sylvia acted as the anesthetic, keeping me calm and distracted with her talk of empowerment and strategic growth. I leaned in closer to the screen, my eyes narrowing. Julian's arrogance was his greatest vulnerability. He was so convinced that I was a technological dinosaur that he hadn't even bothered to use a sophisticated encryption. He had named the folders using a simple alphanumeric code that, to anyone else, looked like random strings of numbers. But I recognized the sequence. They were the cataloging numbers of the antique pieces I had sold 3 years ago to fund his firm's expansion. It was a twisted, sadistic joke. He was using the very items I had sacrificed to label the accounts where he was hiding the stolen money. It was more than a theft. It was a desecration. Then, I found the smoking gun that linked Sylvia directly to the shell company. I pulled up the public filings for Aura Holdings, which were registered in a quiet office park in Delaware. Julian was listed as the managing partner, but the registered agent was an LLC I didn't recognize. I stayed up until the clock on the mantel struck midnight, digging through layers of corporate filings until I found a single, digitized signature on a lease agreement for the company's design office. The ink was digital, but the flourish was unmistakable. It was Sylvia's signature, the same elegant, loopy S she used on my birthday cards. She wasn't just a beneficiary of the stolen funds, she was a co-conspirator who had provided the physical infrastructure for the fraud. The analytical side of my brain took over, pushing the pain of the betrayal into a small, locked box in the corner of my mind. I began to print. Every transaction, every cross-referenced date, every fraudulent invoice was organized into a series of professional-grade preservation folders. I didn't just have screenshots, I had a narrative. I was documenting the slow, methodical murder of my financial security with the same meticulous care I would use for a fragile Renaissance manuscript. Julian wanted market value? I was going to show him the true cost of his optimization. A small, bitter smile touched my lips as I looked at the growing pile of evidence. Julian had called me a cracked teapot, noble but useless. He didn't understand that in my world, a cracked teapot that has been expertly repaired, a process known as kintsugi, is actually stronger and more valuable because its history is laid bare in gold. He and Sylvia were the ones who were fragile. Their entire empire was built on a foundation of lies, and lies are like dry rot. They look solid until the moment they crumble into dust under the slightest pressure. I reached into my desk drawer and pulled out a small, unassuming black device, a digital recorder disguised as a high-end fountain pen, a gift from a colleague who worked in museum security. I tested the weight of it in my hand. Tomorrow, Julian would expect me to be a weeping mess, a woman drowning in her own stagnation. He would expect me to beg for more than 48 hours to pack. I would give him exactly what he expected. I would play the role of the broken, outdated wife to perfection. I would let him gloat. I would let him confess his crimes in the arrogance of his victory, thinking he was speaking to a ghost. The rain finally began to taper off, leaving a damp, oppressive silence in its wake. I stood up and stretched, my body aching but my spirit feeling strangely light. They thought they were clearing out a collection of old things. They didn't realize they were triggering a forensic investigation that would end in a federal courtroom. I was no longer the curator of their happiness. I was the auditor of their downfall. And as I turned off the lights in my study, leaving the folders stacked neatly on the desk, I knew one thing for certain. Julian and Sylvia were about to learn that the past they so despised was coming for their future. The pale, unforgiving light of a Wednesday morning filtered through the oak trees of Pasadena, casting long, skeletal shadows across my desk. I hadn't slept. My eyes burned with the strain of 12 hours staring at LED screens, but my hands were steady as I reached for a fresh set of acid-free archive folders. In my profession, we say that the object never lies, only the provenance does. People can forge a signature or a story, but they can't forge the chemical composition of the ink or the specific wear on the fibers. Money, I was discovering, had its own chemistry. I began the financial excavation of Aura Holdings with the cold detachment I would use to strip a botched 1950s varnish off a 17th century masterpiece. I had the spreadsheets open, 6 years of joint bank statements on one screen and my personal inheritance logs on the other. Julian had been meticulous, I'll give him that. He didn't take the money in one sweeping heist. He bled me out in small, rhythmic increments. $10,000 for market research, $15,000 for portfolio diversification, $7,000 for administrative overhead. But when I ran the aggregate totals, the number that flashed on the calculator made the air leave my lungs. $412,864. That wasn't just a number. It was a lifetime of my father's labor in the aerospace industry. It was the fund I had set aside to ensure my mother, who was currently in the early stages of memory loss, would never have to spend a single day in a facility that didn't smell like jasmine and home. Julian hadn't just stolen from me. He had stolen the safety net of an elderly woman who used to bake him apple pies every Sunday. The cruelty of it was a physical weight, a cold stone in the center of my chest. I zoomed in on the consulting invoices, filed by Sylvia's design firm to Aura Holdings. This was where the theft became poetic in its ugliness. Sylvia had billed Aura Holdings for concept development and aesthetic curation. One invoice for $22,000 was dated the same week I was in London for a conservation conference. The description read, "Selection of primary palette for executive suite." I knew that palette. I had seen the photos on Sylvia's private Instagram, the one she thought I didn't follow. It was the silk wallpaper and the custom Italian furniture for the Love Nest apartment they had rented in Santa Monica. My money, my father's money, had paid for the bed where my husband and my best friend slept, while I was across the Atlantic working to save our future. Every brunch Sylvia had bought me, every supportive spa day she insisted we go on, was paid for with the interest from the accounts she was helping Julian drain. She wasn't just a mistress. She was a bookkeeper of betrayal. I pulled up the property tax records for a small industrial building in the valley. It was owned by a subsidiary of Aura Holdings. Using a trick I'd learned from a colleague in the FBI's art crime team, I tracked the wire transfers back to their source. Julian had been using my personal art collection as collateral. He had taken out bridge loans against the very paintings that had been in my family for 3 generations, pieces I had told him were never to be sold. He had forged my digital authorization on the loan documents, likely using the password I'd shared with him when we were optimizing our estate plan 3 years ago. The audacity of it was breathtaking. He had bet my history to fund his future with my friend. I didn't cry. Tears are for the broken, and I was being tempered. Instead, I opened a new document and began a forensic timeline. Each entry was a layer of the fraud. I looked at the final tally. Over $400,000 in direct theft, and nearly double that in unauthorized debt. They had intended to leave me with the debt while they rode off into the sunset with the cash. They wanted me to be the unstable ex-wife who couldn't keep her mother in her home, while they looked like the successful, modern couple of the year. "You want a modern ending, Julian?" I whispered to the empty room, my voice as sharp as a diamond-tipped stylus. "I'll give you one, but it's not going to be the one Sylvia designed for you." I reached for my phone and dialed a number I hadn't called in a long time. A forensic accountant who specialized in white-collar crime. It was time to turn these speaking numbers into a death warrant for their reputations. The morning sun was too bright, a mocking contrast to the clinical coldness that had settled over me. I sat at the kitchen island, a half-empty cup of tea between my hands, watching the steam rise. I had spent the last 3 hours making the house look like a tomb of a woman who had given up. I left a few boxes half-packed in the hallway, taped sloppily with "kitchen" scrawled in shaky handwriting. I let my hair fall over my face and wore an old, oversized sweater that made me look smaller, frailer. In the world of art restoration, if you want to catch a master thief, you have to make the bait look irresistible. You have to make the treasure look unprotected. When Julian walked in at 10 a.m., he didn't even take off his sunglasses. He strode through the foyer with the ownership of a man who had already mentally replaced the locks. He saw the boxes and let out a short, satisfied huff of a laugh. He walked into the kitchen, leaning against the counter just a few feet from me, smelling of expensive cologne and the smugness of a predator who thinks the prey has stopped running. "Good girl, Eleanor," he said, his voice dripping with a condescension that made my skin crawl. "I knew you'd see reason. There's no point in making this ugly. You pack your memories, I'll handle the future, and we can both move on with our lives." I didn't look up. I let my voice tremble just enough to be convincing. "How could you do it, Julian? Aura Holdings? The money for my mother's care? I saw the transfers." I felt the weight of the fountain pen tucked into the pocket of my cardigan, its tiny, high-definition microphone waiting for the vibration of his voice. Julian didn't flinch. He didn't even deny it. Instead, he pulled out a chair and sat across from me, his expression shifting from bored to menacingly sharp. He reached into his leather portfolio and pulled out a thin blue folder. I recognized the letterhead immediately. It was from the psychiatric clinic I had attended 5 years ago, briefly, after my father passed away. It was a time of grief, not madness, but in the hands of a shark like Julian, a prescription for mild anti-anxiety meds could be spun into a tale of total mental incompetence. "Let's talk about seeing things, Eleanor," he whispered, sliding the folder toward me. "You're upset. You're confused. You're seeing thefts where there are only investments. If you try to bring up Aura Holdings in court, or if you make even the slightest noise about Sylvia, this folder becomes public record. I'll have you declared an unstable witness. I'll argue that your obsession with the past has finally snapped your tether to reality. Do you really want the Pasadena social circle to know you've been unwell for years? Do you want a court-appointed conservator telling you when you can see your mother? I looked at the folder, then up at him, letting a single tear, one born of pure, concentrated fury, track down my cheek. You would use my father's death against me? You were the one who told me to see that doctor, Julian. You said it would help me process the grief. He leaned back, a cruel, triumphant smile playing on his lips. I was looking out for our future, Elle. Even back then, I knew your integrity would eventually become a liability. Sylvia was right about you. You're too fragile for the real world. You're a museum piece. Beautiful to look at, but you shatter the moment someone puts a little pressure on you. And the $400,000? I asked, my voice a broken whisper. You admit you took it? You admit you used my father's money to buy that apartment for you and Sylvia? Julian laughed, a dry, rasping sound that echoed in the quiet kitchen. Admit it? Eleanor, I earned that money. I spent 6 years listening to you drone on about provenance and heritage while I was out there making real moves. Consider it a management fee for the years I spent being the husband to a ghost. Sylvia understands the value of $1. She understands that power isn't in what you keep, it's in what you take. So here's the deal. You sign the quitclaim deed to this house, you take your little archive and your mother, and you vanish. If you don't, I'll use these records to put you in a facility where you won't have to worry about tradition ever again. He stood up, tapping the blue folder with his manicured index finger. You have 24 hours left, Eleanor. Don't be a hero. You don't have the stomach for it. He turned and walked out, his footsteps heavy and arrogant on the hardwood. I waited until I heard the roar of his SUV pulling out of the driveway before I reached into my pocket and clicked the pen off. My hand was no longer shaking. The broken woman vanished, replaced by the specialist who knew exactly how to handle a toxic spill. Julian had just handed me the missing piece of the puzzle. He hadn't just admitted to the theft. He had admitted to a premeditated plan to use my medical history as a weapon of extortion. In the eyes of a judge, that wasn't optimization. That was a felony. I walked over to the sink and splashed cold water on my face, looking at my reflection in the mirror. The outdated woman was gone. In her place was someone Julian had never met. The person who was going to make sure he never worked in the financial sector again. I dried my face, picked up the blue folder, and walked back to my study. It was time to add a new chapter to the Aura Holdings file: blackmail and moral turpitude. The roar of Julian's SUV had barely faded when I began my own transformation. In the world of high-stakes art restoration, anonymity is a tool. If you want to see the true nature of a seller, you don't walk into an auction house draped in diamonds. You blend into the background like a shadow on a fresco. I traded my oversized, broken wife sweater for a charcoal trench coat, wrapped a silk Hermes scarf around my head in a classic Hollywood tuck, and slid on a pair of oversized black sunglasses. I looked like every other wealthy, grieving widow in Pasadena, invisible in my conformity. I knew exactly where they were going. Every Wednesday after Julian handled the office, he met Sylvia at the Gilded Rose, a boutique bistro tucked away in a cobblestone alleyway where the elite went to whisper secrets over overpriced appetizers. I arrived 10 minutes after them, taking a small, secluded table in the far corner of the patio, shielded by a dense wall of manicured boxwoods. The air was cool, smelling of damp earth and the heavy floral perfume Sylvia favored, the kind that lingers long after she's left a room, marking her territory. Through the gaps in the leaves, I saw them. They were seated in their usual booth, the one bathed in golden light. Sylvia was radiant, her laughter ringing out like a discordant bell. She reached across the table, her hand, the one that had once held mine at my father's funeral, resting possessively on Julian's arm. The velvet mask was gone. In its place was the sharp, predatory grin of a woman who had finally caught the prize she had spent 20 years coveting. "Did she sign?" Sylvia asked, leaning in, her voice low but carrying with a needle-like precision through the quiet patio. Julian let out a short, scoffing bark. "Not yet, but she will. I played the medical card. Mentioned the instability file. You should have seen her, Sylvia. She looked like a ghost that had just realized it was dead. She actually asked me about the Mother's Care Fund. Can you imagine? Still worrying about the legacy while her own roof is being sold from under her feet." Sylvia giggled, a sound so devoid of the warmth I had once cherished that it made my stomach turn. Poor Elle. She's just so heavy. All that history, all those traditions. It's like she's trying to walk through life wearing a lead suit. I told her years ago she needed to modernize, but some people are just born to be relics. Julian took a long sip of his martini, his eyes dark with a triumphant gleam. "We'll have the Aura Holdings Gala next month. Once the quitclaim is filed and the house is ours, we'll move the office into the main library. It's the perfect backdrop for the heritage brand we're building. People love the smell of old money, even if the person who actually earned it is locked away in a condo in Arizona." Sylvia clinked her glass against his. "To the new era, Julian. No more dusty vases, no more integrity speeches, just growth. And finally, a house that reflects my taste." They laughed then, a shared, intimate sound that felt like a hot iron against my soul. They weren't just stealing my money. They were planning to inhabit my skin, to use the Vance name as a suit for their own hollow ambitions. A waiter approached my table, and for a split second, the cold dread of being discovered spiked in my chest. I lowered my head, pretending to study the menu, my heart hammering against my ribs. If Julian saw me now, he would use it as proof of my paranoia, another bullet in his folder of my mental decline. But the waiter merely set down a glass of water and drifted away. I took a breath, the panic receding into a focused, icy rage. I looked back through the hedge. Julian was showing Sylvia something on his phone, likely the bank balances I had spent all night analyzing. They looked so secure, so untouchable in their shared arrogance. They thought they were the architects of a new empire, but they were actually just two people standing on a frozen lake, laughing at the sound of the ice beginning to crack. They had no idea that while they were toast to my stagnation, I was recording their celebration. My phone, tucked into the outer pocket of my coat, was capturing every word, every boastful admission of their scheme to seize my mother's home. Sylvia mentioned the Aura Holdings launch again, laughing about how she had managed to convince me that the shell company was a safety net for my mother's medical expenses. "She actually thanked me for the financial wisdom," Sylvia whispered, shaking her head. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Julian squeezed her hand. "Don't. She's the one who chose to be outdated. We're just the ones who know how to survive the future." I stood up quietly, leaving a $20 bill on the table for a water I hadn't touched. I didn't need to hear any more. I had seen the partnership in its full, grotesque glory. Julian and Sylvia believed they had already written the ending to my story, casting me as the tragic, broken woman who lost her way. They didn't realize that in my world, the most valuable discoveries aren't found in the sunlight. They are found in the dark, beneath layers of dirt and deception. I walked out of the bistro, the cool Pasadena air filling my lungs with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. They were laughing at my expense, thinking they had already won. But they didn't know I was writing the final chapter of their careers. They were laughing at my expense, thinking they had already won. But they didn't know I was writing the final chapter of their careers. What would you do if you found out your best friend of 20 years was the architect of your ruin? Would you confront her or wait for the perfect moment? Let me know by commenting "Justice" below. And don't forget to like this video to support my journey. The Los Angeles County Courthouse in downtown is a place of cold marble and echoing truths. a stark contrast to the manicured, whispered deceptions of Pasadena. As I walked up the wide stone steps 3 weeks after that rainy Tuesday, the air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of salt from the coast. I wasn't wearing an oversized sweater or the mask of a broken woman today. I wore a bespoke navy suit, my grandmother's vintage brooch pinned to the lapel, and a composure so absolute it felt like armor. In my world, when an artifact is under threat, you don't hide it in the dark. You place it under the brightest, most unforgiving light. Julian was already there, standing in the hallway outside Department 24. He looked impeccable in a charcoal pinstripe suit, flanked by 2 lawyers who looked like they'd been carved from ice. Sylvia was with him, ostensibly there as a character witness, though she was dressed more for a victory party in a champagne-colored silk dress that screamed of the money they'd stolen from me. When Julian saw me, he didn't look worried. He looked annoyed, like he was waiting for a slow-moving exhibit to be cleared away so he could begin his real work. "Last chance, Eleanor," he whispered as I approached, his voice low enough that only I could hear. "Sign the agreement now, and we'll tell the judge we've settled. If we go through those doors, I'm opening that blue folder. I'll make sure everyone in that room knows you've lost your mind. Your mother's care, your reputation, your career. It all goes up in smoke." I looked at him, not with anger, but with the clinical curiosity I'd use on a particularly clever forgery. The thing about history, Julian, is that it's immutable. You can try to rewrite it, but the original layers always remain. I didn't wait for his reply. I turned and walked into the courtroom. The hearing began with the usual legal formalities, a dry recitation of assets and dates. Julian's lead attorney, a man with a voice like a grinding stone, stood up with a practiced sigh of regret. "Your Honor," he began, "my client has tried to handle this matter with the utmost discretion. However, we are deeply concerned about Mrs. Vance's capacity to manage the estate. We have documentation from her own psychiatric history that suggests a pattern of instability, specifically an inability to distinguish reality from her sentimental attachments to the past." He held up the blue folder, the one Julian had used to threaten me in my own kitchen. I sat at the petitioner's table, my hands folded neatly on a stack of professional-grade archive folders. I felt the judge's eyes on me, a sharp, no-nonsense woman who had seen every trick in the book. I didn't flinch. I waited. "Mrs. Vance?" the judge asked, her voice echoing in the high-ceilinged room. "Do you have a response to these allegations?" I stood up slowly. I didn't look at the blue folder. I didn't look at Sylvia, who was watching from the front row with a faint, mocking smile. I looked directly at the judge. "Your Honor, my husband's counsel is correct about one thing. I am deeply attached to the past. Specifically, the financial past of our joint accounts and the provenance of a shell company known as Aura Holdings." I heard Julian's chair scrape against the floor. The air in the room shifted. I opened my first folder, a meticulous, cross-referenced dossier of every transfer, every fake invoice, and every collateralized loan Julian had executed over the last 5 years. While Mr. Vance was busy curating a narrative of my instability, I said, my voice resonating with a clarity that silenced the room, I was performing a forensic audit. My profession involves identifying the minute inconsistencies that reveal a fraud. What I found was not a woman losing her mind, but a husband systematically stripping her of $400,000 to fund a parallel life with the woman sitting in the front row. I laid the first set of documents on the bailiff's tray. Julian's lawyer tried to object, his voice rising in a panicked register, but the judge held up a hand. She was already scanning the top page, a direct link between a withdrawal from my mother's care fund and the lease for a Santa Monica apartment signed by Sylvia. "But the most important piece of provenance I have to offer today," I continued, reaching into my bag and pulling out a small silver thumb drive, "is not on paper. It is a recording of my husband's own voice, taken in our kitchen, where he admits to the theft and explicitly threatens to use my medical history to blackmail me into silence. The silence that followed was absolute. I looked over at Julian. The smugness had vanished, replaced by a gray, sickly pallor. Sylvia had gone rigid, her hand clutching her designer bag so hard her knuckles were white. They had walked into this courtroom thinking they were the masters of the modern world, where lies could be laundered as easily as money. They forgot that in a court of law, just as in a museum, the only thing that matters is the truth you can prove. "Your Honor," I said, my voice dropping into a tone of quiet power. "Mr. Vance called me outdated because I believe in integrity. He thought my skills were a relic. Today, I'd like to show him that the outdated woman knows exactly how to preserve justice." The judge looked from the folders to Julian, her expression hardening into something terrifyingly final. "I believe I've seen enough to start the questioning," she said. The gavel didn't fall yet, but the sound of the room, the hum of the air conditioning, the rustle of paper, felt like the beginning of an avalanche. Julian's confidence didn't just crack, it disintegrated. He looked at Sylvia, but for the first time in years, she didn't smile back. She was already looking for the exit. Judge Holloway didn't just look at the documents. She absorbed them with the terrifying focus of a hawk. The silence in the courtroom was no longer the quiet of a formal proceeding. It was the heavy, breathless tension of a gallows. I sat perfectly still, my spine a straight line of ancestral grit, watching as the modern empire Julian and Sylvia had built began to liquefy under the heat of the truth. Julian's lawyer, a man who had entered the room with the swagger of a victor, was now frantically whispering to his client, his face drained of its professional sheen. "Mr. Vance," Judge Holloway said, her voice dropping into a register that made the court reporter pause for a microsecond. "These records indicate that Aura Holdings, a company you claimed was an independent investment vehicle, share the same registered business address as Miss Sylvia Thorne's interior design studio. It also appears that the initial seed capital for this company was pulled directly from a joint account designated for elderly care and heritage preservation. Can you explain why your wife's inheritance was used to lease a luxury loft in Santa Monica that she has never visited?" Julian opened his mouth, but only a dry, clicking sound came out. He looked at Sylvia, his eyes pleading for a graceful exit she no longer possessed. Sylvia, however, was no longer looking at him. She was staring at the monitor where my lawyer, Marcus, had projected a side-by-side comparison of Sylvia's design invoices and Julian's market research fees. The numbers matched to the cent. It wasn't just a divorce settlement anymore. It was a map of a conspiracy. "Your Honor," Marcus said, standing up with a calm authority that made Julian's legal team look like amateurs. "We aren't just looking at the commingling of assets. This is a calculated effort to defraud a spouse, using a shell company as a laundry for embezzled funds. My client has provided the court with the Aura Holdings ledger, not the one Mr. Vance showed his accountants, but the one he kept on an encrypted drive he thought my client was too outdated to understand. It shows over $400,000 in direct theft. But more importantly, it shows that Miss Thorne was not merely a witness. She was a beneficiary, receiving monthly consulting payments that conveniently covered her personal credit card debt and the lease on her Mercedes." The courtroom gasped. I saw Sylvia flinch as if she'd been physically struck. Her velvet mask didn't just slip, it shattered, leaving behind the face of a woman who realized the house of cards she had built on her best friend's back was falling on her own head. She looked at Julian, her lips curling into a snarl of pure, self-preserving instinct. "I told you we should have used a different bank," she hissed, her voice carrying through the hushed room like a poisoned dart. The judge's gavel hit the desk with a sharp crack. "Miss Thorne, you are not a party to this marriage, but you are very much a party to this evidence. I suggest you remain silent until you have your own counsel present." I turned my head slightly to look at Sylvia. For 20 years, I had shared my secrets, my wine, and my home with her. I had watched her children grow, and she had watched me bury my father. To see her now, sweating under the fluorescent lights, her silk dress clinging to her in a way that looked cheap rather than chic, wasn't painful. It was enlightening. She was just a forgery. A well-executed one, perhaps, but a forgery nonetheless. "Julian," I said, my voice quiet but cutting through the chaos. "You said I was a ghost in my own life. You said I was drowning. But a ghost doesn't keep receipts, and a drowning woman doesn't take notes. You and Sylvia were so busy laughing at the past that you forgot it's the only thing that actually lasts. Your future was bought with my father's sweat, and today, the bill is due." Julian's arrogance had completely evaporated, replaced by a desperate, frantic energy. He looked at the judge, his hands shaking. "Your Honor, it's a misunderstanding. Eleanor is spinning these numbers to look malicious. I was trying to grow our wealth. Sylvia was just a consultant." "A consultant who shares your bed and your stolen bank accounts?" Judge Holloway interrupted, her eyes flashing with a cold, judicial fire. "Mr. Vance, I am referring this file to the District Attorney's Office for an investigation into financial fraud and embezzlement. But as far as this court is concerned, the Aura Holdings assets are being frozen immediately. And given the evidence of extortion regarding Mrs. Vance's medical history, I am granting her an emergency protective order and exclusive possession of the Pasadena residence." The air left Julian as if he'd been punched. He slumped back into his chair, the Italian suit suddenly looking 2 sizes too big for him. He was no longer the high-flying fund manager. He was a man caught with his hand in the jar, realizing the jar was actually a trap. Sylvia stood up, her chair screeching against the floor. "Julian, you idiot! You said she wouldn't know. You said she was too stupid to look at the cloud." "She didn't look at me. She couldn't." She grabbed her bag and tried to push past the bailiff, but he stepped into her path with the silent, immovable weight of the law. The Aura Holdings empire was gone. The modern love story was a crime scene. And as I sat there, watching the 2 people who had tried to erase me being escorted into a side room for further questioning, I felt a strange, quiet hum of satisfaction. Julian had wanted a market value settlement. Well, he got it. The market had just crashed, and he was the only one left holding the debt. The conference room adjacent to Department 24 was small, sterile, and smelled faintly of floor wax and desperation. A single fluorescent light hummed overhead, casting a harsh, unforgiving glow on the 2 people who had once been the center of my universe. Julian was hunched over the laminate table, his tie pulled loose, his expensive charcoal jacket discarded on a chair like a shed skin. Across from him, Sylvia was pacing the 3 steps of floor space allowed by the cramped room, her silk dress rustling with every frantic turn. They weren't looking at each other. The partnership of the future had lasted exactly 45 minutes under the pressure of a criminal referral. I walked in with Marcus, my lawyer, trailing behind me. I didn't sit down. I stood at the head of the table, my hands resting lightly on the back of a chair, watching them. In my work, we call this the stabilization phase. Once the decay has been stopped, you have to decide what is worth saving and what needs to be discarded. "Eleanor," Julian said, his voice cracking as he looked up. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a hollow, watery-eyed fear. "Elle, please. The district attorney? That's prison time. You don't want that. Think of the firm. Think of our reputation in Pasadena. We can fix this. I can pay it back. I'll liquidate some of the other offshore holdings." "With what money, Julian?" I interrupted, my voice as cool as a marble tomb. "The judge froze your accounts. Every cent you optimized is currently in a state of judicial stasis. You aren't in a position to negotiate with your charm anymore. You're in a position to negotiate for your freedom." Sylvia stopped pacing and turned to me, her eyes darting like a cornered animal's. "It was his idea, Elle. All of it. The Aura Holdings, the Santa Monica loft. He told me you were already checked out. He said you wanted a quiet life and that we were just managing the transition. I didn't know he forged your signature on the art loans. I swear on my life, I didn't know." Julian let out a harsh, bitter laugh. "You didn't know?" You're the one who picked the wallpaper for the loft with the money from her mother's care fund, Sylvia. You're the one who told me Eleanor was too stuck in the past to ever check the cloud backups. Don't play the innocent victim now that the handcuffs are clicking. It was a beautiful, ugly sight. The two people who had laughed at my outdated loyalty were now tearing each other apart to save their own skins. It was the natural conclusion of a life built on greed. When there's no more left to steal from others, predators start eating each other. Marcus stepped forward and slid a thick stack of papers across the table. "This is the full restitution and relinquishment agreement," he said, his voice professional and devoid of pity. "It's very simple. You sign over every interest in Vance Capital. You sign over the deed to the Pasadena house and the vacation property in Big Sur. You acknowledge the theft of $412,000 and agree to a lifetime ban from the financial services industry. In exchange, Mrs. Vance will provide a statement to the district attorney acknowledging your full cooperation in the recovery of the assets. It might keep you out of federal prison, though the state charges for the forgery are still on the table." Julian stared at the pen on the table as if it were a venomous snake. "Everything? You want me to walk away with nothing?" "You didn't walk in with anything, Julian," I said, leaning forward until I was looking him directly in his bloodshot eyes. "You walked in with a rented suit and a handful of promises. I'm just taking back the capital I invested in a bad asset. You called me outdated because I value the long game. Well, this is the end of the game. You and Sylvia can have each other. You can have the modern life you wanted, free from the burden of my history and my mother's collection. But you'll be doing it from a studio apartment in the valley, working whatever job will hire a disgraced felon." Sylvia reached for the pen first. Her hand was shaking so violently the nib chattered against the paper, but she signed. She didn't even look at Julian as she pushed the papers toward him. She was already gone, mentally calculating how much her jewelry would fetch at a pawn shop. Julian lingered. He looked at me, perhaps looking for a flicker of the woman who used to wake up early to make him breakfast. The woman who believed his every lie because she couldn't imagine a world without honor. He found nothing. I was as unyielding as the artifacts he'd tried to sell. He signed. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of 6 years of lies finally being buried. I picked up the folders, the receipts of my life, and turned to the door. "Elle?" Julian called out, his voice small and pathetic. "Where are you going to go?" "The house. It'll be empty. Just you and those old things." I paused at the door, the sunlight from the hallway spilling across my shoulders. I didn't turn around. "I'm going to go see my mother, Julian. And then, I'm going to start a restoration project that has nothing to do with furniture. I'm going to enjoy the silence of a home that doesn't have a thief in it." I walked out, the click of my heels on the marble floor sounding like a gavel. Behind me, I heard the sound of Sylvia and Julian starting to scream at each other again, their voices muffled by the heavy door. They were finally exactly where they belonged, trapped in a room with the only person they truly loved, themselves. The air outside the courthouse was surprisingly sweet, a crisp breeze blowing in from the Pacific that seemed to wash away the lingering scent of perjury and cheap perfume. For the first time in 6 years, my lungs felt fully expanded. I didn't rush back to the Pasadena house. Instead, I drove to the small, sun-drenched garden where my mother was sitting, her hands folded over a quilt I had restored for her years ago. I didn't tell her about the lawyers or the shell companies. I just sat with her, watching the hummingbirds dart through the lavender. She looked at me, her eyes clear for a fleeting, beautiful moment, and patted my hand. "You have your father's eyes today, Eleanor," she whispered. "The ones that know exactly where the North Star is." I realized then that Julian and Sylvia hadn't just failed to break me. They had inadvertently stripped away everything that wasn't essential, leaving behind a woman who no longer needed their validation to be whole. A week later, while I was overseeing the final inventory of the Pasadena estate, not to pack it for Julian, but to prepare it for sale, my phone rang. It was a name I hadn't seen on my screen in nearly a decade. Elias Sterling, the senior partner at a top-tier firm in Silicon Valley. He had been the lead counsel for Arthur, my first husband. Arthur and I had married young, a whirlwind of intellectual passion that had eventually cooled into a deep, mutual respect. We had parted ways because he wanted to build empires of code and light, while I wanted to preserve the world of ink and wood. There was no drama, no betrayal, just two people realizing they were walking toward different horizons. We hadn't spoken in years, but I had always kept a small, quiet corner of my heart reserved for the man who first taught me that integrity is the only currency that never devalues. I met Elias at a quiet library in San Marino. He looked older, his hair a shock of white, but his eyes were as sharp as ever. He placed a thick vellum envelope on the table, the kind of stationery that feels like a physical weight. "Arthur passed away 3 months ago, Eleanor," he said softly. "He fought a very private battle with a very aggressive illness. He didn't want you to see him decline. He wanted you to remember him as he was when you were 24, standing on the deck of that sailboat in Monterey." My heart tightened, a dull ache of grief for a man who had truly known me. Elias slid the envelope toward me. "He spent his final years watching you, Eleanor. Not in a way that intruded, but in a way that protected. He saw what Julian was doing. He saw the aura holding scheme before even you did. He wanted to step in, but he knew you. He knew that if he fought your battle for you, he'd be stealing your victory. So, he waited. He waited to see if the woman he loved still had the grit to exhume the truth." I opened the letter. Arthur's handwriting was still the same, bold, slightly messy, and full of life. "Dear Elle," it began, "if you're reading this, it means you finally cleared the weeds out of your garden. I watched you handle the rats, and I've never been prouder. You always said that heritage is something we earn, not just something we inherit. You earned yours through fire. I'm leaving you my stake in the venture capital trust, approximately $120 million. Don't use it to buy more things, Elle. You never cared for things. Use it to protect the people who aren't as strong as you. Use it to ensure that the outdated values we both loved, truth, craftsmanship, and honor, never go out of style. The world needs a guardian. I can't think of anyone better for the job. With all my respect, Arthur." The room seemed to tilt. $120 million. To Julian, that number would have been a trophy, a way to buy more masks and more status. To me, it was a responsibility. It was the ultimate restoration project. I sold the Pasadena house a month later, not out of bitterness, but because that chapter had been fully preserved and archived. I moved my mother to a stunning estate in the rolling hills of Napa, a place of ancient oaks and silent mornings where she could watch the seasons change in peace. But I didn't retire. I used Arthur's legacy to establish the Vance Heritage Fund. We don't just restore old buildings. We provide legal and financial forensics for women who find themselves trapped in the same web of financial abuse I once inhabited. We teach them how to find the receipts. We teach them that their stagnation is actually their strength. Standing on the terrace of my new home, the golden California sun setting over the vineyards, I looked at a small blue and white porcelain bowl sitting on the stone railing. It was a kintsugi piece, broken centuries ago and repaired with seams of pure gold. It was more beautiful than it had ever been when it was whole. Julian had called me outdated because I clung to the past. He didn't realize that the past is the only thing that gives the present any meaning. He and Sylvia were now footnotes in a legal textbook, struggling to pay rent in a world that had no use for their kind of modernity. I, however, had finally found my true provenance. I wasn't just a curator of dead things. I was a protector of living truths. As the wind picked up, carrying the scent of rosemary and wild grass, I realized that Arthur was right. Heritage isn't just what we keep, it's how we keep it. And I intend to keep it with everything I have. I thought I was fighting to save my home, but I was actually fighting to become the woman I was always meant to be. Sometimes, the universe has to take away everything you thought you wanted to give you everything you actually need. If this journey has touched you, If it has reminded you that your integrity is your greatest asset, please subscribe and join our community. Your story isn't over just because someone tried to rip out the pages. It's just beginning. Thank you for listening, and remember, work hard, stay honest, and never let anyone tell you that your values are outdated. You are exactly who the world needs right now.